Bumpy Johnson once offered Frank Lucas $1 million to kill a man. Frank Lucas said no. That single word changed Harlem forever and made Frank Lucas the richest gangster in America. March 15, 1967, 2:47 a.m. The phone rang inside Frank Lucas's apartment. Frank picked it up on the second ring. He already knew who it was. Only one man called at this hour. Bumpy Johnson's voice came through the line, weak, strained. Cancer was killing him slowly. "Come to my place, now. I have a job for you." Frank didn't ask questions. When Bumpy called, you showed up. 3 minutes later, Frank was dressed. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie. The uniform of a man who might need to move fast. He stepped into the cold Bronx night and drove toward Harlem. The streets were empty. Even the hustlers had gone home. But Bumpy Johnson never slept anymore. Pain kept him awake. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. Frank had watched it happen month by month. The king of Harlem, the man who ruled these streets for 40 years, was dying, and everyone knew it.
Bumpy's townhouse door was unlocked. That alone told Frank something was wrong. Bumpy Johnson was paranoid about security ever since someone tried to kill him in 1952. Frank walked inside. The hallway was dark. Photographs lined the walls. Bumpy with politicians, celebrities, athletes. Proof of power. Proof of reach. He passed the living room where legendary parties once shook Harlem. The kitchen, where Bumpy's wife used to cook Sunday dinners for the whole crew. Now the house was silent. She had moved out 6 months earlier. She couldn't watch him die. Frank climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't know what Bumpy wanted, but he knew this conversation would change everything. Bumpy sat in a wheelchair beside the bed. Oxygen tubes ran into his nose. A blanket covered his legs. His hands trembled on the armrests. The same hands that had strangled men and signed million-dollar deals. But his eyes were still sharp, still dangerous. The eyes of a man who survived 40 years in a business that killed most men in 5. Bumpy didn't greet him. He pointed to a briefcase on the nightstand. "Open it."
Frank lifted the case. It was heavy, too heavy. He popped the latches. Inside were stacks of cash, hundreds wrapped in rubber bands, row after row, packed tight. More money than Frank had ever seen. "How much is this?" Frank asked. $1 million. Frank's heart stopped. In 1967, $1 million could buy city blocks. It could buy freedom. It could buy a new identity anywhere in the world. Frank grew up dirt poor in LaGrange, North Carolina. Sharecroppers, nothing owned, nothing promised. He came to New York with less than $20. Now $1 million sat in front of him. "What do you want me to do?" Frank asked. Bumpy leaned forward, wincing in pain. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I want you to kill Nicky Barnes." If you think this story ends the way you expect, subscribe now, because what happens next rewrote the rules of organized crime. Frank sat back. Nicky Barnes, Bumpy's protege, his chosen successor, the man Bumpy had groomed for years to take over Harlem. Bumpy had taught him everything: numbers, power, politics, survival. "Why?" Frank asked. Bumpy's face twisted, not with rage, but betrayal. "He's been stealing from me for 3 years.
But betrayal. He's been stealing from me for 3 years. Skimming 10% off every deal, building his own network behind my back." Bumpy paused, struggling to breathe. "Last week, I found out he's talking to the Italians, promising them Harlem when I'm gone." His voice shook. "He's selling everything I built to the same people I fought for 40 years. Frank said nothing. He knew Barnes. Smart, charming, dangerous. But Frank had always sensed something else, a hunger that never stopped, a hole where loyalty should have been. "You're the only one I trust," Bumpy said, "the only one who can get close." He gestured toward the briefcase. "Take the money, kill him. When I die, and I will soon, everything goes to you."
Frank stared at the cash. One pull of a trigger, an empire in return. Frank had killed before. In this world, sometimes you killed or you died. But this was different. This was an execution, of a man he'd known for years. Frank Lucas wasn't a hitman, he was a businessman, and there was a line he never crossed. No. The word escaped before he could stop it. The room froze. Nobody said no to Bumpy Johnson. Not mob bosses, not politicians, not cops. Bumpy's eyes widened. What did you say? Frank slid the briefcase back. I'm not killing Nicky Barnes. Not for $1 million, not for $10 million. That's not who I am. The room went silent, and in that silence, Harlem's future shifted.
Bumpy Johnson once offered Frank Lucas $1 million to kill a man. Frank Lucas said no. That single word changed Harlem forever and made Frank Lucas the richest gangster in America. March 15, 1967, 2:47 a.m. The phone rang inside Frank Lucas's apartment. Frank picked it up on the second ring. He already knew who it was. Only one man called at this hour. Bumpy Johnson's voice came through the line, weak, strained. Cancer was killing him slowly. Come to my place, now. I have a job for you. Frank didn't ask questions. When Bumpy called, you showed up. 3 minutes later, Frank was dressed. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie. The uniform of a man who might need to move fast. He stepped into the cold Bronx night and drove toward Harlem. The streets were empty. Even the hustlers had gone home. But Bumpy Johnson never slept anymore. Pain kept him awake. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. Frank had watched it happen month by month. The king of Harlem, the man who ruled these streets for 40 years, was dying, and everyone knew it.
Frank could hear Bumpy breathing hard. The oxygen machine was humming. Frank's own heart was beating so loud in his chest that he was sure Bumpy could hear it too. He just told the most powerful man in Harlem to go to hell. His life was probably over. Bumpy would probably have him killed before the sun came up, left in some alley somewhere. Just another dead body that nobody would ask about. Then Bumpy did something Frank never expected. He smiled. Not a mean smile. Not the smile of someone about to order a killing. A real smile. The smile of someone who just found exactly what they were looking for. Good. Bumpy leaned back in his wheelchair. All the tension in the room disappeared like morning fog. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Frank was confused. His mind couldn't understand what was happening. What? I've been testing everyone, Frank. Everyone who works for me. Everyone who wants to take over when I'm gone. I've had this same conversation in this same room with this same briefcase 12 times in the past 2 months. I offered them the same deal, the same $1 million, the same target. You know what they all said? Frank shook his head. They all said yes.
Every single one of them, ready to kill Nicky Barnes for the money without asking a single question, without thinking twice, without wondering if it was a trap, without caring whether Nicky actually deserved to die. They just saw the money and started counting it. Bumpy pointed at Frank. His finger was bony and shaking, but his aim was steady. But you said no. You pushed the money away. You told the most powerful man in Harlem that you weren't going to do what he asked. That takes something, Frank. That takes principles. And principles are the only thing that separates a king from a regular criminal. Hit that like button if you're realizing right now that Bumpy Johnson was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Because what he tells Frank next changes everything.
Bumpy reached under his blanket and pulled out a folder. Thick, heavy, stuffed with papers and photos and documents that looked older than Frank. This is everything, Frank. Every business I own, every property, every bank account, every offshore account, every safe deposit box, every connection I've made in 40 years, every favor that's owed to me, every secret I've kept. This is 40 years of building an empire, and I'm giving it all to you. Frank stared at the folder like it might explode. Why me? You barely know me. I've only been working for you for 5 years. I've been your driver, your errand boy. I'm nobody. That's exactly why, Bumpy said. Everyone else has been around too long. They're corrupted, comfortable, lazy. They think they deserve what I built because they've been here for 20 years. They've gotten fat on my success. They've forgotten what it's like to be hungry. But being entitled doesn't build empires, Frank. Hunger does. and you're the hungriest person I've ever met." Frank couldn't argue with that. He was hungry, had been hungry his whole life. Hungry to escape being poor. Hungry to be somebody.
Hungry to escape being poor. Hungry to be somebody. Hungry to prove that a black man from the South could build something that mattered. That hunger was the only thing that had kept him alive.
Bumpy opened the folder and started explaining everything. The numbers game that brought in $50,000 a week, runners in every neighborhood, collectors who made their rounds like clockwork, protection from the cops who were paid to look the other way, the nightclubs that served as fronts for other operations, Small's Paradise on 135th Street, the Cotton Club legacy, places where you could wash dirty money, make connections, and keep your finger on the pulse of Harlem all at once, the relationships with bad cops who didn't just look the other way, but actually helped, Detective Marcus Williams, who warned Bumpy before raids, Sergeant Patterson, who made evidence disappear, Captain O'Brien, who controlled the whole police station, the connections to politicians who owed their careers to Bumpy's money and muscle, a state senator, 2 city councilmen, a judge who had never ruled against anyone Bumpy sent his way, the supply chains, the distribution networks, the enforcers who kept everyone in line, the lawyers who kept everyone out of jail. Everything. It was overwhelming. Frank had known Bumpy was powerful, but he'd never understood just how big this was.
This wasn't just a criminal business. This was a shadow government, an alternative system of power that existed alongside the official one, but followed different rules.
"But here's the most important thing," Bumpy said. He pulled out a piece of paper with a name and address written on it in careful handwriting. "This is a man named Ike Atkinson. He's a sergeant in the U.S. Army stationed in Bangkok, Thailand. Right now, he's smuggling small amounts of heroin back to the States through military channels. Nobody checks military cargo. Nobody searches Army planes. Nobody questions soldiers coming home from Vietnam. It's the perfect pipeline." Frank studied the paper. The name meant nothing to him, but the possibilities were already forming in his mind. "You want me to work with him? I want you to think bigger than him. Ike is bringing in kilos. I want you to bring in tons. The Italians control the heroin trade because they control the French connection, the supply from Marseille through the Corsican gangs into New York. They've had a monopoly for 20 years, but that supply is weak, cut to hell by the time it reaches the streets. 5% purity, maybe 6 if you're lucky. The real product is in Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, pure, uncut 98%. The kind of heroin that makes the Italian product look like baby powder.
If you can get that product directly from the source and bring it to Harlem without going through the Italians, you'll control the entire market. You'll be richer than I ever was, richer than the mafia ever dreamed of being, richer than anyone." Frank's mind was spinning. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was a blueprint for an empire. A roadmap to becoming the most powerful drug dealer in American history. But it was also a death sentence if he got caught. The Italians would kill him, the DEA would hunt him, the other dealers would try to take what he built. He'd be making enemies everywhere he turned.
"There's one more thing," Bumpy said. His voice got quiet, serious, the kind of serious that meant life and death. "Nicky Barnes is going to come after you. The moment I die, he's going to try to take everything. He's already made deals with the Italians, already promised him he'll bring Harlem back under their control, give them their cut again, let them run things the way they did before I took over. And the Italians are going to back him because they'd rather have a puppet they can control than a king they can't. So what do? You let him think he's winning. Let him make his moves, let him get comfortable, let him build his little alliances and make his little plans. And when he's confident that he's about to take over Harlem, when he thinks he's already won, you show him what real power looks like." Bumpy handed Frank a key. Small, brass, old, the kind of key that opens something important. "Safe deposit box at Harlem Savings Bank, box 1147. Inside you'll find $2 million in cash and documents that prove Nicky Barnes has been informing for the FBI since 1965. Frank nearly dropped the key. The metal suddenly felt hot in his hand. "Nicky's a rat. Has been for years."
In his hand. "Nicky's a rat. Has been for years. The feds have been protecting him. That's why he's never been arrested while everyone around him goes to prison. That's why he's always one step ahead of every bust. That's why he walks around Harlem like he's untouchable. because he is untouchable as long as he's useful to the FBI. Nothing can touch him. Frank thought about all the times Nicky had seemed to know things he shouldn't know. All the close calls that everyone else took but Nicky somehow avoided. All the dealers who got arrested right after meeting with Nicky. It all made sense now. But if that information gets out, Bumpy continued, the Italians will kill him themselves. They hate rats more than they hate us, more than they hate anyone. A rat is worse than a murderer in their eyes. If they find out Nicky's been talking to the feds, they'll put a contract on him so big that every hitman in New York will be looking for him.
Bumpy grabbed Frank's hand. His grip was weak, the grip of a dying man, but his eyes were fierce, burning with the last fire he had left. Promise me something, Frank. Promise me you'll build something bigger than I ever could. Promise me you'll make them remember that Harlem belongs to Harlem. Not the Italians, not the feds, not the politicians who treat us like votes and then forget we exist. Us. Our people. Promise me. Frank looked at the folder full of secrets, the key to the safe deposit box, the briefcase still sitting on the nightstand with $1 million inside. He thought about his mother back in North Carolina, still living in poverty. His brothers and sisters who never got out. Everyone who'd ever told him he'd never be anything. I promise. Hit that subscribe button right now if you want to see how Frank Lucas kept that promise, because what he did next made him the most legendary gangster in American history.
July 7th, 1968, 2:17 p.m. Bumpy Johnson died at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street and 7th Avenue. He was eating fried chicken, his favorite meal, the same meal he'd been eating at that restaurant for 30 years. Halfway through, he grabbed his chest. His face went gray. He tried to say something, but no words came out. Then he fell forward into his plate and never moved again. Heart attack. The cancer had weakened him so much that his heart just gave up. Dead before anyone could even call an ambulance. Dead before he could finish his last meal. Frank got the call 15 minutes later. He was at his apartment in the Bronx, going over the papers Bumpy had given him, learning the business, memorizing the names and numbers, preparing for what came next. When the phone rang, he knew. He knew before he even picked it up. Bumpy's gone. 3 words. That's all it took. Frank hung up the phone. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't punch a wall or pour himself a drink. He got dressed, put on his best suit. Black, respectful. The suit of a man going to claim what was his. And he drove to Harlem.
The streets were already buzzing when he arrived. Word travels fast in Harlem. By the time Frank crossed the bridge, there were people gathered outside Wells' restaurant. Some crying, some just standing there staring, unable to believe that Bumpy Johnson was really dead. The king was gone, and everyone was wondering what came next. Who would take over? Who would control the numbers? Who would protect them from the Italians? Who would keep the peace? Frank knew exactly what came next. He drove straight to Harlem Savings Bank, walked in like he owned the place, went to the safe deposit boxes in the back. Box 1147. He used the key Bumpy had given him. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. Inside the box was exactly what Bumpy had promised. $2 million in cash, stacked neat, wrapped tight. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And a folder thick with documents. Frank opened it and started reading. Photographs of Nicky Barnes meeting with FBI agents. Clear shots, undeniable. Transcripts of conversations where Nicky gave up names, addresses, operations. Payment records showing the FBI had been giving Nicky money for years. Enough evidence to destroy him 10 times over. Frank took everything, the cash, the documents, put it all in a duffel bag and walked out of the bank. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked questions. He was just a man in a suit carrying a bag. Nobody knew he was carrying the future of Harlem.
The funeral was 3 days later. Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, the biggest, most famous black church in Harlem, the kind of church where history happened. 2,000 people showed up, politicians in expensive suits, gangsters in even more expensive suits,
celebrities who owed Bumpy favors, musicians who'd gotten their start in his clubs. Everyone who was anyone in Black America came to pay respects to Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem for 40 years. Frank arrived late on purpose. He wanted everyone to see him walk in. He wanted them to wonder why he was late. He wanted them to notice. He was carrying a briefcase, not the same briefcase Bumpy had shown him, but an identical one. This one was filled with Frank's own money, $100,000 in cash. Every dollar he'd saved in 5 years of working for Bumpy, his entire net worth. Frank walked straight down the center aisle, 2,000 people watching him, past the pews filled with mourners, past Nicky Barnes, who was sitting in the second row with that smug look on his face, like he already knew he was going to take over, like the crown was already on his head.
Past the Italian representatives who'd come to see how the power would shift. Past the politicians who were already calculating who they needed to make friends with next. Frank walked all the way to the front, to the casket, open casket. Bumpy looked peaceful, his face relaxed. No more pain, no more cancer eating him from the inside. He was finally free. Frank stood there for a moment, said a silent prayer. Then he opened the briefcase. The church went silent. 2,000 people holding their breath. Nobody knew what Frank Lucas was about to do.
Frank pulled out the first stack of $100 bills, $10,000. He placed it in the casket next to Bumpy's hand. Then another stack, $20,000. Then another, $30,000, $50,000, $75,000, $100,000, placed around Bumpy's body, like treasure being buried with an ancient king. The kind of tribute you give to someone who changed your life, someone who saw something in you that nobody else saw, someone who gave you a chance when nobody else would. The church was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This was something they'd never seen before, something that would become legend. Then Frank turned around and faced the congregation. 2,000 faces staring at him, some confused, some impressed, some angry. Frank's eyes found Nicky Barnes. Nicky's smug expression was gone, replaced by something else. Fear, uncertainty, the look of a man who just realized the game was changing.
"Some of you think you're going to take what Bumpy built," Frank said. His voice carried through the church without a microphone, clear, strong, the voice of a man who wasn't asking permission. "Some of you think you're going to divide up his empire like a Thanksgiving turkey. A piece for you, a piece for you. Everybody gets a taste. Some of you have already made deals with people outside this community, promised them you'll bring Harlem back under their control. Sell out your own people for a seat at somebody else's table." Frank's eyes stayed on Nicky. Everyone in the church turned to see who Frank was looking at. "You're all wrong. Bumpy Johnson didn't leave his empire to a committee. He didn't leave it to be divided up. He left it to me, all of it. And I'm telling you right now, in front of God and everyone in this church, that Harlem belongs to Harlem. Anyone who has a problem with that can come see me directly." Nobody said a word. Nobody challenged him. The Italians watched him with new eyes. Nicky Barnes looked like he wanted to disappear. And Frank Lucas walked out of that church a different man than he walked in. He walked in as Bumpy's driver.
Then he walked in. He walked in as Bumpy's driver. He walked out as the new king of Harlem. Drop a comment right now telling me if you think Frank can hold on to that crown, because Nicky Barnes and the Italian Mafia are about to come for everything he has. And what happens next will blow your mind.
3 weeks after the funeral, Nicky Barnes made his move. He'd been planning this for years, waiting, watching, building alliances while pretending to be loyal. And now that Bumpy was dead, there was nothing holding him back. Nicky called a meeting with the heads of the 5 Italian crime families. The meeting was at a restaurant in Little Italy, Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street, neutral territory. Nicky walked in wearing a custom suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Gold watch, diamond rings, the look of a man who thought he was already in charge. Sitting at the table were the most powerful criminals in New York: Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Carmine Tremuti.
Men who had ordered hundreds of murders. Men who controlled billions of dollars. Men who thought they controlled Harlem too. Frank Lucas is a problem, Nicky told them. He spoke with confidence, the confidence of a man who had been practicing this speech for years. He's got no connections outside Harlem, no organization that extends beyond the neighborhood, no experience running an operation this big. He's a driver, an errand boy. Bumpy made a mistake trusting him. The Italians listened.
They didn't interrupt. That's how you knew they were interested. Give me 6 months, Nicky continued. 6 months and I'll have Harlem back under control. Your control. We go back to the old arrangement. 50-50 split on everything. You supply the product, I distribute it. Everyone makes money the way it should have been all along. Carlo Gambino leaned forward. He was an old man, quiet, never raised his voice. But when he spoke, people listened, because the quiet ones were always the most dangerous. And Frank Lucas? I'll handle Frank. He'll be out of the way before you know he was even there. Gambino looked at the other bosses. A silent conversation passed between them. The kind of conversation that decided who lived and who died. We'll give you the support you need, Gambino said finally. Soldiers, money, protection from the police we control. But we want proof that you can deliver. Take care of Frank Lucas. Make it clean, make it quiet. Then we'll talk about the future. Nicky smiled. The smile of a man who thought he'd already won. Consider it done.
But Nicky made a mistake. The same mistake men had been making about Frank Lucas his whole life. He underestimated him. While Nicky was in Little Italy making deals with the Italians, Frank Lucas was on a plane to Bangkok. He'd taken Bumpy's advice, contacted Ike Atkinson, used the connections Bumpy had given him to arrange a meeting, and now he was flying halfway around the world to see the operation for himself. The flight took 36 hours, 3 layovers. Frank had never been outside the United States before, never had a passport, never seen a world that wasn't New York or North Carolina. But he wasn't nervous. He was focused, hungry, ready.
When Frank landed in Bangkok, Ike Atkinson was waiting for him. Ike was Army through and through, built like a tank, the kind of man you wanted on your side in a fight. He'd been running small-scale smuggling operations for years. Heroin hidden in furniture, in coffins, in the personal effects of soldiers coming home from Vietnam. Small stuff, a few kilos here and there, enough to make money, but not enough to attract attention. Ike took Frank to meet his suppliers. They drove for hours into the jungle, past villages where people had never seen a television, past poppy fields that stretched to the horizon, until they reached a processing facility hidden in the mountains. And what Frank saw there changed everything.
The heroin was pure, 98% pure. Frank had the product tested right there, watched the chemist run the analysis. The Italian product that came through the French connection was 5%, maybe 6%. This was 98%. You could cut this product 20 times and it would still be stronger than anything on the streets of New York. And the price was nothing. What the Italians were charging $50,000 for, Frank could get for $5,000. The markup was astronomical. The profit margins were insane. Frank made a deal right there. He'd buy the heroin directly from the producers. No middleman, no Italian tax, direct from the source. Ike would handle transportation. His army connections could move anything. Coffins full of heroin hidden among the real bodies of soldiers killed in Vietnam. Nobody checked those coffins. Nobody searched them. It would be disrespectful to the dead. The perfect cover. Frank came back to New York with a plan that would make him the richest drug dealer in American history. He called his product Blue Magic, the purest heroin ever sold on the streets of New York. 98% pure. Cut it in half, and it was still 4 times stronger than anything the Italians had.
Sold at half the price, the fiends went crazy. Word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Blue Magic, the best product anyone had ever seen. People were traveling from Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, New Jersey just to get their hands on Frank's heroin. The lines outside his spots stretched around the block. Within 6 months, Blue Magic controlled 70% of the heroin trade in New York. The Italians' business collapsed. Their customers disappeared. Their dealers couldn't compete. Nobody wanted the weak, overpriced garbage they were selling when they could get blue magic. Subscribe right now, because what happens next between Frank and Nicky is going to blow your mind. And I promise you, nobody tells this story the way I'm about to tell it.
Nicky Barnes was left with nothing. The Italians blamed him for failing to stop Frank. His promises of taking back Harlem were worthless now. Frank Lucas had done what nobody thought was possible. He'd cut the Italian mafia out of the heroin trade entirely. His own people started switching sides. The soldiers Nicky had recruited saw which way the wind was blowing. They wanted to work for the winner, and the winner was Frank Lucas. The empire Nicky thought was his for the taking crumbled before it ever existed. He was a general without an army, a king without a kingdom, a rat without a hole to hide in.
December 1971, 3 years after Bumpy's funeral. Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day. Not a week, not a month, a day. He owned properties across New York and New Jersey, 100 houses, commercial buildings, nightclubs. He had corrupt cops, judges, and politicians on his payroll. Not just beat cops taking $50 to look the other way. Detectives, captains, prosecutors, people who could make evidence disappear, people who could tip him off before raids, people who could make sure his people never stayed in jail for long. He had a fleet of luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Cadillacs, Mercedes. He had women. He had respect. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had kept his promise to Bumpy Johnson. He had built something bigger than Bumpy ever dreamed. Harlem belonged to Harlem, and Frank Lucas was its king.
But Frank made a mistake. The same mistake that destroys every king eventually. He got comfortable, confident, visible. When you're on top, you start believing you'll always be on top. March 8, 1971, the Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century. 15 rounds between the two best heavyweight boxers who ever lived. Every celebrity, every gangster, every power player in America was there. The tickets cost a fortune. The ringside seats cost a bigger fortune. And Frank Lucas showed up wearing a chinchilla coat and hat that cost $50,000. He walked through Madison Square Garden like he owned it, which in a way he did. He had more money than most of the people there, more power than the politicians sitting in the cheap seats. He sat ringside, better seats than the mafia bosses, better seats than the corporate executives. Right there where everyone could see him. A detective named Richie Roberts was working security that night. Roberts was one of the few honest cops left in New York. Couldn't be bribed, couldn't be bought. The kind of cop other cops hated because he made them look bad. Roberts saw Frank, saw the coat, saw the seats.
Bad. Roberts saw Frank, saw the coat, saw the seats, saw the way people treated him, and asked himself a question that would change everything. Who is that guy? And how does he have better seats than Carlo Gambino?
Roberts started asking around. Nobody knew Frank Lucas, at least nobody in the law enforcement world. He didn't have a record, didn't have a file, didn't exist as far as the police were concerned. A black man in a $50,000 coat sitting ringside at the biggest fight of the century, and nobody knew who he was. That was wrong. That meant Frank Lucas was someone who should be known. Roberts started investigating. It took 4 years. 4 years of tracking shipments, turning informants, following money, connecting dots that didn't seem to connect, building a case piece by piece. Frank Lucas was careful, smarter than most. But nobody's perfect, and Roberts was relentless.
January 28, 1975. Richie Roberts and the DEA kicked down Frank Lucas's door, the house in Teaneck, the mansion with a swimming pool and a garage full of luxury cars. They found $584,000 in cash, hidden in walls, hidden in furniture, hidden in places most people would never think to look. They found heroin. They found ledgers. They found evidence of the entire operation. Frank Lucas was arrested, facing life in prison. 70 years. He was never going to see the outside of a cell again. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what Frank does next is the most gangster thing in this entire story.
Frank Lucas wasn't going down alone. He remembered what Bumpy had told him about Nicky Barnes, about the documents proving Nicky was an FBI informant. Frank had been holding on to that information for 7 years, waiting for the right moment, keeping it like a loaded gun in a safe. This was the moment. Frank made a deal with the prosecutors. He would cooperate. He would give them everything: names, addresses, operations, routes, corrupt cops, dirty politicians, judges who took bribes, prosecutors who made cases disappear, everyone who had helped him build his empire. In exchange, his sentence would be reduced. He'd do real time, but not 70 years, not life, something he could survive. But first, Frank had one more card to play, the ace he'd been saving since that night in Bumpy's bedroom. He gave the prosecutors the documents proving Nicky Barnes was an FBI informant. The photographs, the transcripts, the payment records, everything. Within weeks, the information leaked. Maybe Frank leaked it. Maybe the prosecutors leaked it. Maybe it just found its way out the way secrets always do. But suddenly, everyone in New York knew the truth. Nicky Barnes, the man who called himself Mr.
The same Italians who had promised to back him put a contract on his head. A real contract with real money. The kind of contract that made every hitman in the city start looking for Nicky Barnes. Nicky's own organization turned against him. The people he'd recruited, the people he'd paid, the people who'd sworn loyalty. They all wanted him dead now. An informant was the lowest form of life in their world. Worse than a murderer. Worse than a rapist. A rat. Nicky's empire collapsed overnight. Everything he'd built, everything he'd stolen, everything he'd schemed for, gone. By 1978, Nicky Barnes was arrested, sentenced to life in prison without parole. And when the other inmates found out he was an informant, his life became a living hell. Nicky eventually became a federal witness himself, testified against everyone he'd ever worked with, gave up names, sent people to prison, destroyed lives the way his life had been destroyed. He spent the rest of his life in witness protection, hiding, running, looking over his shoulder, never knowing if today was the day someone finally caught up with him. He died in 2012, alone, forgotten, under a name nobody knew. No funeral, no tribute.
Forgotten, under a name nobody knew. No funeral, no tribute. No one mourning. Just a man who had betrayed everyone and been betrayed by everyone in return.
Frank Lucas served 7 years of a 70-year sentence. 7 years. The information he provided led to over 100 convictions. Corrupt cops, dirty politicians, drug dealers. The biggest takedown in DEA history. He got out in 1982. Made more money. Old habits die hard. Got arrested again in 1984. Served another 7 years. Got out for good in 1991. Spent his last years in Newark, New Jersey. Gave interviews. Consulted on the movie they made about his life, American Gangster. Denzel Washington played him. He died on May 30th, 2019, 88 years old, surrounded by family. Remembered as a legend, not as a forgotten rat hiding in witness protection. As a legend.
Subscribe right now and hit that like button because this story proves something important, something that applies to life way beyond the streets. Bumpy Johnson tested everyone who wanted his empire. He sat in that wheelchair, dying from cancer, and offered $1 million to kill a man. And everyone said yes. 12 people. Every single one ready to commit murder for money. Except Frank Lucas. Frank said no. He pushed the money away. He refused to be a hitman. And that single decision, that one moment of principle, is what made Bumpy trust him with everything. Think about that. The irony is beautiful. Frank Lucas became the richest gangster in American history not because he was willing to kill for money, but because he wasn't. He became a legend not because he was the most ruthless, but because he had a code, a line he wouldn't cross. Bumpy Johnson saw something in Frank that no one else saw. Hunger, yes. Ambition, yes. Intelligence, yes. But also integrity. The kind of integrity that seems like a contradiction in a world of criminals, but it's not. Because in any world, at any level, the people who last are the people who have principles.
The ones who last are the people who have principles.
The ones who know what they won't do are more dangerous than the ones who will do anything. That's why Bumpy gave Frank the blueprint. That's why Bumpy gave Frank the connections. That's why Bumpy gave Frank the key to the safe deposit box. That's why Bumpy gave Frank the documents that would destroy Nicky Barnes when the time was right. Because Bumpy knew that Frank Lucas wasn't just a gangster. He was a king waiting for a throne. And kings don't kill for money. They build empires. They outlast their enemies. They become legends.
This is the untold story of how one word changed history. How one refusal created the richest gangster America has ever seen. The $1 million Frank Lucas refused in 1967 was worth more than $10 million today. But what Frank built instead was worth more than $1 billion. Sometimes the best deal you ever make is the one you walk away from. Sometimes the most powerful word you can say is no. Rest in peace, Bumpy Johnson, 1905 to 1968. The king who found his successor by testing who would refuse his money. Rest in peace, Frank Lucas, 1930 to 2019. The man who said no and built an empire. The man who kept his promise. The man who proved that Harlem belongs to Harlem. The end.